So in the last episode we learnt about Nanjing and the capital city plan, and this episode we're going to learn about the people who lived in it. Kai-shek was the leader of the Nationalist Party and of China during the Nanjing Decade from 1927 to 37, and he was quite a popular figure both in China and abroad. It was his portrait that hung on Tiananmen Square before Mao Zedong did, and he was quite well known abroad, possibly due to his wife Mei-ling, who herself was an important political figure of the early 20th century. Unfortunately, however, he got a rather bad nickname abroad as General Cash My Check because he was always asking foreigners to lend him money. Now, in the early years of the Nanjing Decade, the government faced the difficult decision of building a city with inadequate funds, and the nationalists had to make some really difficult decisions about what buildings to build first. And one of the first buildings was this one, the Ministry of Railways, designed by Robert Fan. And Robert Fan also designed this hotel for foreign guests and delegates behind us. Now, railways were seen as key to industrial modernisation and prosperity, so that was why they chose to build the Ministry of Railways first. And the railway project was hugely ambitious. Initially, Yat-sen had planned to build 160,000 kilometres of railway in the space of 10 years. And to give you some kind of context, China today has about 130,000, which is still 30,000 short of Sun Yat-sen's figure. So this hugely ambitious project required huge investment, both domestically and from abroad. So one way to secure this investment would be to invite financiers to the classy surroundings of the Ministry of Railways and put them up in a nice hotel like this. So this rather shabby looking building here would have been quite spectacular in its day. It was the former Supreme Court. The architect, Bo Yang-mo, designed the central structure of this building to mimic the Chinese character shan, meaning mountain, to illustrate the phrase 治法如山, meaning to maintain the law as firm as a mountain. And the bowl-shaped fountain as well has a similar function because it illustrates the phrase 一碗水端平, meaning to hold a bowl of water level, i.e. to be impartial. And it was here in the Supreme Court where one of China's most notorious communists was put on trial, a man called Chen Du-xiu. So who was Chen Du-xiu and who were the communists? Well, Chen Du-xiu was one of the two founding members of the Communist Party in 1921, and he was the first General Secretary and the undisputed leader. He was known at the time as China's Lenin. In 1922, he was forced to form an alliance with the Nationalist Party, even though he didn't think it was a very good idea. And 2 years later, it fell apart, and he was blamed and removed from all positions of leadership. In 1932, Chen Du-xiu was arrested by the Nationalists, and he was a bit of a fearless man. He fell asleep in the car the whole way from Shanghai to Nanjing. It was widely assumed that he would be executed, but he said to them, "If you're going to kill me, then get on with it." So it was perhaps his fearlessness in the face of mortal danger that spared his life. And on the 26th of April 1934, he was tried here and given 13 years in prison. When he was released from prison, he moved to Chongqing, where he became a teacher in a junior high school. And for the last decade of his life, he faded into obscurity, living a life of poverty, bad health and isolation. In 1949, when the communists came to power, Chen Duxiu was made an example of, to show Communist Party members not to deviate from party orthodoxy.
Initially, the government was to be split into 5 courts, or yuan, and this was home to 2 of them. The legislative yuan, in charge of making and enacting laws, and the control yuan, in charge of monitoring the other branches of the government. So it was here, if you like, that they made sure that everyone both inside and outside of the government was doing what they should be. But if that makes you think that everything was under control, then you can think again. Corruption during the Nanjing Decade was still a huge problem. And Chiang Kai-shek was not only aware of this, but he himself was very much involved. Now, before he moved to Nanjing, he was living in Shanghai, where he became acquainted with a very interesting character called Du Yuesheng, or Big Ear Du. Big Ear Du was the leader of Shanghai's largest underworld criminal gang. Du Yuesheng wore only Chinese silk and surrounded himself by white Russian bodyguards. He also had 3 live monkey heads sewn to the back of his clothing, because he was very superstitious. Big Ear Du was in charge of China's opium dens, gambling dens and brothels, but he also set up some legitimate companies, like 2 banks and Shanghai's largest shipping corporation. He was the leader of the Green Gang, and him and his Green Gang were very anti-communist, so they helped Chiang Kai-shek in his fight against the communists during the Civil War. And in return, Chiang Kai-shek made Du Yuesheng the president of the National Suppression of Opium Bureau, which meant, ironically, Du Yuesheng, an addict himself, was effectively in charge of China's entire opium trade. Du Yuesheng was a classic example of a man who rose from rags to riches, and in the early 1930s he used his money and influence to establish a temple in Shanghai that was dedicated to his ancestors and family members. He held a huge big party for the opening and invited all sorts of politicians and celebrities to take part. But after only a month of the temple opening, the private wings at the back had been turned over into the production of heroin, making it the largest drug factory in Shanghai. So it's crazy to think that Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of China, had such a close relation with the man who was in charge of the underworld, and to think that such dodgy dealings might have been going on even in a building like this one behind us. The Nanjing Decade in Chinese is sometimes referred to as the Golden Decade, but it's clear that Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists had many struggles throughout this period, and so it wasn't exactly golden. Another one of their challenges was to defend against the Japanese, who first invaded in 1931, in what was known as the Mukden Incident. And one man who led the counterattack to the Mukden Incident, Ma Jianshan, became a celebrity both in China and abroad. And one rather clever company even cashed in on this, making a brand of cigarettes called Ma Jianshan cigarettes. And even though the cigarettes themselves were not supposed to be very good, people smoked them to show their political views, and there was this rising anti-Japanese sentiment throughout the Nanjing Decade. On the 13th of December 1937, the Japanese captured Nanjing, and for the following 6 weeks they ruthlessly raped and killed thousands of civilians in what's known as the Nanjing Massacre. The estimated number of deaths ranges from 40,000 to as many as 300,000. Much of Nanjing's architecture was destroyed, or buildings took on very different functions. For example, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs became the International Red Cross, and would you believe it, our gangster drug lord Du Yuesheng was the vice president of the International Red Cross during the anti-Japanese war. During the Japanese War, the Communists and the Nationalists joined forces to fight against the Japanese, who were defeated in 1945, and then civil war resumed. And eventually, in 1949, Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party fled to Taiwan. So this is where the idea of 2 Chinas comes from. because neither officially recognize one another's sovereignty, meaning Nanjing, in the eyes of some, is still the capital today.